Hi everyone, Andy here at Spymaster Gaming. Welcome back to the channel and a very warm welcome if it's your first time joining us. In today's video, I'm going to be continuing the series How to Start Warhammer for Cheap with part 2, playing your first game of Warhammer. Now if you haven't watched part 1, which is how to build a small force or start building a small army, check it out here. Basically it tells you how to put together a small force without spending too much money, which is the whole theme of this series. Before I go any further, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. I'm still relatively new to YouTube and trying to grow the channel, so anything you can do to help would be greatly appreciated. Right, now I've got that out of the way. Playing your first game of Warhammer. Today's date, which is the 22nd of November 2023, we are currently in 10th edition of Warhammer 40k. For those of you who've never picked up Warhammer before, an edition of Warhammer lasts about 3 years before the new edition comes out. So we're in the 10th edition, but the game has been going for the best part of 30 years at this point. Now, the edition that I'm going to recommend that you start playing with is going to sound a bit counterintuitive because most people will think, oh, sure, it's best to play with the newest edition. But that involves spending money, which is counterproductive to this whole video series. We want to experience Warhammer without spending an arm and a leg. So I'm going to recommend Warhammer 3rd edition. Quite a few editions ago, granted, we're looking at about 25 years ago, but it is, to this day, in my opinion, the most complete rule set that Games Workshop have ever put out in an edition of Warhammer 40k. And the best thing about it is it's free online. If you just give a Google of Warhammer 40k 3rd edition rulebook, you will find a way to download the PDF of it, so you are not spending any money on the rule set. I won't put it in the link, just in case this video is looked at by a certain company and they decide to take action against the owners who have put the PDF up. But just know that currently it's available. And even if you don't want to use a PDF, you can pick up a copy of this rule book between £5 to £10, 10 or so dollars. They're quite easy to come by in the wild, and you can find one easily enough. So I'm going to give you a bit of a rundown of the rulebook and then showcase, using the models that I got from the previous video, how I put together a little force to play a beginner game of Warhammer 40k. So here we have the rulebook for the 3rd edition of Warhammer 40k. Quite a hefty tome, over 200 pages, but don't let that put you off. You've got the classic artwork on the front by an artist called John Blanche, who is the originator of the grimdark theme for Warhammer 40k. You have in this book the complete game, which is why I've chosen it. You have the rules, you have the scenarios that you get to play, and you have the army lists. Now, in subsequent editions of Warhammer 40k, Games Workshop has split elements of these out into separate books that you'd have to buy. But this, at the beginning of 3rd edition, was a complete game. You wouldn't have to buy anything else. It had 9 army lists for different factions, and the chances are that if you've used my advice in the first video to pick up some models, you'll be able to field an army from one of those 9 army lists. You can see the classic Space Marine detachment there, some painting and modelling advice, all nicely juxtaposed against the core black and white rules, which I think are very stylized for the time. Now, it's important to note that you're probably thinking, surely the game has changed between 3rd and 10th edition. It has, but fundamentally, the models use the same profiles, the damage and everything to wound is pretty much the same. There are more layers in the modern edition. It's probably a bit more complex. But this had its own quirks. It had the use of templates for blast weapons, which are included in the book as well, and some other nice little things which haven't made it through to subsequent editions. But it doesn't mean that it's not valuable. I say here with the battles, it tells you how to set up a battlefield, and it's got different tables for generating terrain effects and what the sort of the damage the battlefield can deal to your units or what cover it can provide, and basic army composition as well. So it's important to note that with this game, you have units based on the type of unit that you can use, but it's also against points values for the unit. So you'll set a points value and you'll assemble a force based on the army structure that you're allowed to use. So it sounds a bit confusing, but honestly, after a read of it, it's quite straightforward. It's even got its own campaign system, which Games Workshop have started separating out into individual codexes in this edition, which basically means each army has its own campaign system, where this was a universal campaign system for all armies, which was pretty cool. And then you come onto the actual army lists, as I say. So you can see the profiles, the war gear, everything that you would need to know to put your army together. And you're not at a disadvantage from anyone else because everyone bought this rulebook, everyone had the same information. So you're going into a battle with someone else and they know exactly what you know, and it's all everyone can reference it in front of them, which was really, really nice, which is quite difficult to do now because you'll have to buy other armies' codexes and their army lists separately. And importantly, at the back, you've got the reference cards, which are great. This was probably one of the first times that this was done in wargaming. I've mentioned the templates there, but to have all the core information on a couple of pages of A4, there you go, you can see them there. So just printing that off and having that in front of you should be enough to guide you through a game. Really good edition of 40k, the first edition I started playing, and still the best in my opinion. So after that brief overview of the third edition rules, I decided to play a 500 point game with my friend Sam. 500 points using the force organization rules, as I mentioned in the overview, which consists of 1 HQ, 2 troop units, which I'll explain when I show you my army force, and a number of other units as well. Now, the terrain that we're playing on, you'll see that we're playing on a nice winter-themed battle map. We've got nice buildings, we've got trees. When you're playing your first games, this doesn't really matter. I would not recommend you go and buy terrain for a game that you might not enjoy. Use everyday household items to make terrain on a 4 foot by 4 foot playing area. This can be the floor, this can be a kitchen table, a coffee table. As long as you've got the rough dimensions to play the game and you've got some items that can act as terrain, that's all you need. I mentioned in the rules the terrain tables generating the effects. With your books that you're using, or your kitchen roll, or your cans of Coke, or whatever you're using to break up the items, just use some post-it notes or piece of paper and just leave a note on there to say what effect it is and what terrain piece it represents, so you've got an idea of what level of cover or hazard that it's providing to your troops. As I say, don't go and buy terrain at this point. There's no point because you may not enjoy it. So I'm going to go over the army that I took from the models that I brought in the first video, and I'll show you Sam's force as well, and then just give you a bit of a rundown of the game turns and a bit of commentary on that. So for this game, my army consisted of 4 units: a bike, a speeder, my captain in Terminator armor attached to a tactical marine squad, and a second tactical marine squad. That is it. Sam's army consisted of an assault squad, a tactical squad, and a biker squad with a psyker. And that's it. So, as I mentioned, Sam and I were using a nice winter-themed terrain set. We'd established what terrain pieces did what in terms of giving cover or acting as hazards, and we were playing a very simple mission called Infiltrators, which meant that I had to rush my troops across to Sam's side of the board, he had to do likewise, and whoever had the most troops in the opponent's deployment zone by the end of the game would be the winner. Now, I got the first turn, meaning that I got to activate all of my units first. Warhammer 40k operates on a system called I Go, You Go. That's what it's colloquially known as in the hobby, meaning that I get to activate all of my units by moving, shooting, engaging in melee combat before my opponent can do the same. And turns go back and forth like that until the last turn, which is turn 6. So you see myself moving the troops up the board here, trying to obviously make ground with the faster vehicles like the speeder, pushing across into Sam's deployment zone and taking some pot shots at the units where I can. It's worth noting that not all war games use this system of activation. There are different ones available on the market, and I'll be covering them in the other games that I cover in this video series. But Warhammer 40k has used this style of activation since its inception, and it hasn't changed even into 10th edition, so just so you're aware of that. So this is turn 1. I'll fast forward a bit so you can see what the rest of the game plays out like. So at the start of turn 2, I've lost my attack bike, and my right flank has turned into where the battleground truly is. I've committed a squad of tactical marines to Sam's unit of bikes and his assault squad, and my speeders out in the open trying to target that assault squad so they don't do any damage. It's not been great for Sam either. He's lost a couple of units, sorry, not a couple of units, but a couple of troops from his one tactical squad on top of the bunker there. But yeah, it's going to turn into bloody melee combat for the next couple of turns on the right side of the field there. Turn 3 saw my speeder move up the board some more. It had lost one of its weapons in the previous turn. It had been targeted by the missile launcher, which had nullified its torpedo missiles. But it's moving up the board to get into the deployment zone. The tactical marine squad on my left flank, they kept on targeting Sam's tactical squad, whittling it down until finally the last man fell and it nullified it as a threat. So there's basically no resistance on the left flank from Sam's point of view. There's no models there. All of his other units are committed to melee combat on the far side of the board, and I knocked a tree down there. So in the fourth turn, basically, I opted to move up the board some more, move my troops up and move quite slowly, and push my speeder into the deployment zone to ensure I'm completing the primary objective of having a unit in Sam's deployment zone. Sam's bikes didn't survive the combat from the last turn. They're all gone, and there's very few uh, assault marines and tactical marines on the far side of the board. We basically keep on going, resolving combat, and no one from Sam's side gets through either, and that pretty much ends the game. So, with my Space Marines taking the victory on the Infiltrators mission, that is a simple game of Warhammer 40k. Now, you're not going to experience all of the many layered interactions that the game has to offer in a simple format like this. We weren't really using different types of war gear, we weren't bringing units with special abilities, really. A couple of obviously unique weapons there, but nothing special. The game has more layers to it than what we've presented, but in its core essence, the moving, shooting, and assault phases, that's all you really need to get your head around, and not much has changed between the different editions of Warhammer 40k. The game that we played took about 45 minutes. Granted that we've both played it before, we know the rules fairly well. If you haven't played the rules, I would expect it would take double that, so an hour and a half, for you to really get your head around it. And once you're referencing all the rules and that, you'll get quicker once you play more games as well. 500 points, not a massive amount of points. Depending on what you buy, as if you follow my advice in the first video, you may have less models. You may want to round it down to say 250 points. Realistically, all you want to be doing as a bare minimum is a HQ choice, so a captain or a leader, and 2 squads, so 2 of the tactical marine squads that I used. Something like that. That could distill it even further into an even simpler game that you could complete in a quicker time. As I say, hasn't changed much between the editions. It's still essentially the same core game with some minor changes. But that's it. It's free. If you want to experience Warhammer for free, I highly recommend this edition. Let me know what you think. Have you played Warhammer 40k 3rd edition? Do you like it? Have you played 10th edition? How do you think 3rd compares to 10th edition? But the question is as well, if you've played it, what happens if you don't actually enjoy it? Because there is a chance that you may not enjoy the way that Warhammer 40k plays. And this is where the crux of this series is going to come into play, because you haven't invested that much money. You're not in the same boat as someone who has invested a lot of money at the start and will want to make the game work for them purely because they've invested so much money. It's something called the sunk cost fallacy. It's a line of reasoning where essentially you've committed resource or emotional input into a venture, and you are determined for it to succeed or determined to be happy with the outcome, even though realistically it may not be very good or might not be very suitable. Now, if you've not spent a lot of money like if you followed the first video's sort of recommendations, you won't be in that camp. So you may not actually enjoy the system, but there's no reason to think, well, that doesn't mean wargaming isn't for me. So in the next few videos, we're going to be looking at different alternatives to Warhammer, where you can use your Warhammer models, but experience different types of gameplay and see what system speaks to you. But that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope if you're a veteran player and you have watched the video and you remember your Warhammer 40k 3rd edition days fondly from what we've just shown there. But like I say, it's not the be-all and end-all from a gaming system perspective. There are other options there, and I'll be covering them in future videos. That's all for now. If you haven't already, please consider liking the video, subscribing. Everything you can do would be greatly appreciated. I'll see you on the next one.